and this is a Daily Buzz exclusive. Today I'm here with Palak Jaiswal, and we're going to be talking about her story that talks about the history of drag in Utah. Palak, thanks for joining us on our very first exclusive for the Daily Buzz.
I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being available for this. Okay, so in your story, you kind of go through the history of drag in Utah. So can you tell us, what is the history of drag in Utah?
Yes, that's a very big question, which is kind of what we tried to answer in this story. And I think a succinct way to put it is basically the history of drag in Utah is that it's been around forever, essentially. It's pretty expansive. We talked to a historian named Connell O'Donovan who helped us put together kind of a timeline of some major events, which dates from like the early 1800s to present day. So that kind of gives you context of how long drag has been around. And I can highlight a couple of the things Connell told us, but I would encourage everyone to look at the full timeline because I cannot do it justice. But basically, so in July 1871, the first instance we have is William Horace Lingard becomes the first actor to kind of perform drag at the Salt Lake Theater. But then in July 1882, Evan Steffens would sing in soprano in a full ladies' costume during a concert also at the Salt Lake Theater. That was backed by a choir of 200 children. And he went on to become the director of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. So all of that kind of leads to present day stuff in 2022 and 2023 where, you know, from Salt Lake to St. George, there has been controversy and kind of backlash against drag shows.
One thing I think I found most interesting is you mentioned that this was in the 1870s and this was in the 1880s. Utah became a state in 1896. So drag in Utah is older than Utah is Utah, basically, than Utah gained statehood.
Absolutely, yeah. It's really interesting. I think one thing that stuck out during the reporting of this story for me is just how it's been everywhere. It's not just history of performances that come through in Utah, but it's also like it's been in art mediums like theater, Shakespeare forever. So it was really interesting to kind of dive into that.
In part of your story, you actually kind of talk about the history of drag as an artistic expression in Utah, specifically like renditions of the musical Hairspray, and then the movie Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which features a drag performer and trans performers, premiered at Sundance. Like, this is not just here, but it's like we are participating in a worldwide drag scene, if you will.
Absolutely. And, you know, Shakespeare is a great example of that. You know, I got to talk to someone from the Utah Shakespeare Festival who essentially said that, you know, without drag, we wouldn't have a core amount of Shakespeare's iconic work. So it's really been everywhere. And, you know, even in popular culture, Miss Doubtfire is a great example. You know, Tom and Jerry. I mean, there's just like so many examples of drag in formats that might not be traditionally thought of as drag, if that makes sense.
One that I think gets brought up a lot that I think especially older generations can relate to is Bugs Bunny dressing in drag to fool Elmer Fudd or to fool the bad guy. I mean, and it's so ubiquitous that we don't even think about it anymore. But like you said, it's only been in recent years that really drag has kind of come under fire. In Tennessee is probably the most popular place or most known place where drag has basically been outlawed. Now, we have had reporter Mark Eddington report on St. George recently had a controversy where the HBO show We're Here that features drag performers going to small towns and putting on drag shows. They filmed in St. George and they faced a lot of backlash from local lawmakers. And a bill was actually brought up in the Utah Legislature that would have put kind of a ban on drag, even though it didn't necessarily say drag. Can you speak more to that? Were you part of that legislative coverage?
A little bit. The bill never actually left committee or anything. We kept an eye on it. But essentially, like Kelly mentioned, the bill itself doesn't use the word drag. It uses adult content. And, you know, in the story, we talked to Marina Lowe over at Equality Utah, who talks about, you know, how vague language like that can lead to problems with the First Amendment. And so Mark Eddington has been covering a lot of this in St. George and up here in Salt Lake. This past year, an all-ages drag show at a tea and wine shop in Sugar House actually saw armed protesters outside of it. And so this is something that happens every day, and it's a very difficult spot to try and create laws to curtail around whatever adult content may be perceived as, And we reached out to the bill sponsor for comment for this story, but they never responded. And so, bottom line, we don't have anything like that here in Utah right now, but it was brought up in the last session, so it's something to keep an eye on in the next one.
I think one thing that maybe our viewers would be interested in, because a lot of times they don't know how reporters report on these types of stories. So how did you get this idea in your head to even report on this, and then how did you go about finding this information?
Definitely. So the idea is a big credit to my editor, Sean Means, who was kind of like, we've been writing a lot about controversy around drag. What if we did something that really looked at the history of drag? And I love history articles. That's kind of my thing. And so reporting-wise, the story is quite expansive. I think we tried to cover a lot of different areas, which is why it's as long as it is. But when I was reporting, I really wanted to ask every individual I interviewed for this story, which I think was about 10 to 11 people, specific questions about drag in their world and in their area of expertise. So whether it was a policy director at Equality Utah, or a drag queen, or a historian. And the fun of reporting this story in particular was that everyone had such different answers about all the questions I asked. So the reporting was really basically just talking to everyone and asking them all the dying questions I had about drag and seeing how they responded. One thing that didn't make the story, this might be a fun fact, is I started every single interview by asking all the interviewees to define in their own words what drag is. And they all had such different, but also very similar core ideas of what drag is. And I think that really got to the idea of drag has never really been defined. And I think a lot of that plays into what's been going on this year. So
yeah, I completely agree with that. There's so many different kinds of drag, and there's different forms of drag, and the history of drag has always changed. And so when lawmakers start looking at ways of banning it, like you said, that vague language, it just doesn't cut it sometimes, because drag can be seen as just a freedom of expression. And so, and reading your story, I was just there is a whole section where you talk about what drag is and what it isn't. And I was just so impressed by this entire story, especially the timeline at the very bottom of the story that kind of goes through the entire history of drag in Utah. So is there any other part of the story that you want to highlight? Anything else you want to talk about?
I think a lot of the interesting parts of the story are at the very end, where I got to talk to a child psychologist at the University of Utah. I think a lot of some of the response we've seen to drag shows recently has, kind of thrown around the word grooming. And I really got to dive into what grooming actually is and where it originated from, which was with Anita Bryant, which it was just a very fascinating conversation. So that's at the end of the story, but I think it's a very interesting tidbit. So it was just so great to talk to so many different people and pull together hopefully what is a pretty good coverage of drag.
No, this is a story that I heard was coming down the pipeline, and I was so excited. And then when I finally read it, I was like, yes, you're answering all the questions I had. You hit all the points I loved. So you will find the Palak story. We'll link to it below. But we do want to hear from you guys. What other questions do you have about drag in Utah? What do you think about state legislators trying to regulate or ban drag in Utah? You can either comment below or you can tweet us at SLTrib. Palak, thank you so much for joining our very first exclusive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. If you guys want these videos as soon as they are live, then be sure that you are subscribed. You can also find us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at SLTrib. What is your Twitter handle?
My Twitter handle is Palick_G-Swald, I think.
Awesome. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. Bye.